Welcome. So nice to have such a great turnout. I love it. And I see a lot of familiar faces and friends and some new ones too. So that's fabulous. So as Tom mentioned, I am really passionate about this topic because before I started my own company about 20 years ago now, it's been more than 20 years, but we just say 20 plus years. We don't exactly specify anymore. I worked in corporate America for a number of companies that you might know: Chase Manhattan, Exxon, Equifax, UPS. I was even a professor for a little while, which is really how I got the teaching, training, coaching bug. And I had good bosses and I had bad bosses. And I worked on great high-performing teams, and I also worked on some dysfunctional teams. Can anyone relate to this? And I worked for some companies that had great corporate cultures and some that were not so much. So what was really apparent to me is that it makes such a difference in terms of how you live your life, how you feel about all areas of your life. So for me, being able to help leaders and teams be more effective really has an impact personally as well as professionally. And I'm sure many of you are in this field for that reason as well. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is this tool, this process called the 5 Behaviors of a Cohesive Team. And it's based on Lencioni's work, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Patrick Lencioni and so forth. For years I was calling him Lencioni, but it's Lencioni. So I'll explain more about how I know that in a moment. But really this whole process is for people who want to help teams in their organization, which I assume because you're here is you, really make better, faster decisions and get to results more quickly, right? And also to make sure that you get the opinions of all team members, not just the loudest and the most vocal person or the top of the hierarchy kind of thing, but also to waste that energy on politics and confusion and so forth. We want to avoid that, obviously. And also really avoid that whole dynamic that happens sometimes when you rehash the same thing over and over again, right? You're just going around in circles and you can't seem to get any traction. So I see nodding heads. I'm sure everybody's had this experience from time to time. But really, it's about creating a competitive advantage, because what I'm going to talk to you about is the changing nature of teams and how today it's not so much the finance and the technology and the strategy. That's all important, but it's really the people that makes the difference, right? And in our field, we know that. We give lip service to that sometimes in companies, but it's really true, and more true as time goes on, okay? So, and also I think it's more fun to work on a team like that, a high-performing team. So it's really about creating results at the end of the day, and I love this visual because a lot of times we feel this way, right? We're like just hanging on. But it's really about something that's very common, we've heard about. It's called the service profit chain. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Or maybe the value profit chain. It comes from an old HBR article and a book of the same name, the service profit chain. And it really means that if we treat our employees well, they will be satisfied. If they are happy, then they're going to treat customers well. And oh, by the way, that results in a profitable company, right? So that's really what this is all about, is making sure that we do employee engagement, not just because it's a nice thing to do, not just because it's a fun, feel-good sort of promise, but because it really makes a difference from a profitability standpoint, okay? So there is a business reason to this, okay? So what I would like to cover today in an hour or so, and I'll leave some time at the end for questions, and I've also passed around my card so that I'm sure to be able to connect with you later. I'm also going to do a little drawing for some prizes I have. So I'm going to ask you, LaShondra, if you would take that orange bowl and pass it around if you'd like to participate, and just put your card in there, and then you'll see what the prizes are. Some of them are pretty fun, okay? But sorry? How many can you put in? One. One per person. There's always an angle with you, Tom. I love it. So what I'd like to talk about is the fact that this is really a competitive advantage. And I've stated that, but I'll reemphasize that. and also really give you an overview of this whole process. It's really a series of facilitated conversations. I wouldn't call it a training program so much as a real facilitated process. And I have the opportunity to do some work with Spelman College using this process next week. And a number of other clients and so forth were in the works talking about implementing this in their organizations. But really, it's all about trust as the foundation and how to manage conflict effectively. Because a lot of times when we hear conflict, we kind of want to run away from it. And I'll share with you all the fabulous tools that are in this program to really help you look at conflict in a more productive way. And I'm going to walk through the report at a high level, and we'll see how far we get. I've got some samples around the room, and I didn't make copies enough for everyone, but I can certainly email you them after the fact. They look prettier in color. I just made some black and white copies for you to share. And as I walk through it, you can look at that with a partner, okay? And again, if you're interested, I'll tell you how you can bring this into your organization, and you can ask me any questions at the end. Sound good? Okay. And I am very used to facilitating and having things be very much interactive and experiential and like a dialogue. So I'll do a little of that and have you experience a couple of mini exercises since we don't have a lot of time, but just so you get a flavor for the program. Sound good? Okay, great. I love it. All right, so Patrick Lencioni.
My interest in teams really stems from my childhood, because when I was a kid, my dad used to come home from work frustrated by his company. Now, he was a great salesman, God rest his soul, and a great guy, but he was always complaining about the way he was treated at work and how dysfunctional things were, and I didn't know what that meant when I was a kid. But later on, when I got my first job as a consultant, I was dealing with things like strategy and marketing and other operational issues in business. And I found myself distracted by this issue of teamwork, because I thought, man, if we could get people working in teams, really working together well, it would change everything from the way we dealt with customers, to the bottom line, and to the way people enjoyed and felt fulfilled in their work. You see, I've come to the conclusion that teamwork truly is the greatest competitive advantage that any group of people can have. And it's not that complicated. It's pretty simple, but it is hard because it requires a lot of work over time and a lot of courage. I think it's actually an intentional, strategic decision we have to make. And by making that decision, we'll be much more likely to accept the cost and the sacrifice that it requires, and that will make it possible for us to encounter the full power of teamwork. You know, if I could say anything to leaders of teams, it would be this. One day you're going to retire from your job, from working. And most people that want to retire think about doing other good things in life. Serving people, doing missionary work or helping the poor, something wonderful, and that's great. I want you to realize that while you're leading this team, you are having a bigger impact on people's lives than you may ever have. You change the way they go home at night, the way they treat their family and their friends and strangers on a bus. You affect their self-esteem, and that's going to carry over throughout their life. So let's not wait till we retire to realize the impact we can have on people's lives. And your ability to build a good team and to help them feel a part of that team might very well be the most altruistic thing you ever do.
So basically, Patrick just really reiterated what I was saying about the fact that as a leader of a team or a member of a cohesive team, you really are making a difference, right? You really are helping people and you're changing the way they go home at night. I love that line. And I also love the fact that he really emphasizes that it is about people, right? It's not about just the strategy. It's not just about the technology. And in today's world, we were saying this in the 80s, but it's really true now. We're much more global, we're much flatter, we're much more virtual, right? I've been doing a lot of work with Aetna, and I've been traveling around the country. We're doing a big employee engagement leadership development training program, and we also do coaching and so forth. And 40% of their workforce is completely virtual, which is a lot, right? So it's really important that we learn how to manage teams more effectively. And we've been talking about this for years, but I think it's still very rare, right? Because again, it's all about really amping up the level of communication. So, I'm just asking you to think about, in your experience, how has the nature of teamwork in your organization changed over the past, 10 years, 5 years, even 3 years? Much more virtual, probably. I see nodding heads, yeah, much more global. Different time zones, you got to think about Australia and China, and everyone in the mix. And so it's really challenging today to think about, how do we make this a more effective process for everyone? And it's not going to go away. It's going to keep getting more and more important, right? So what I'd like to have you do now is just turn to your neighbor, and some of you are in natural groups here, a threesome is fine too. And I'd like you to quickly brainstorm the best and or the worst experiences that you've had on a team, okay? And just to make this simple, how about from Kim on down, you all are going to do the worst possible experiences, okay? And this side of the room, you're going to do the best experience, okay? And 2 minutes, so 1 minute each per person, if you will, and then I'll just ask you a little bit about your experience. You don't have to give me the gory details, but perhaps, what were some of the dynamics that contributed to it being not a good experience or a very positive experience, okay? So I'd like to show you one more video, and this is a great video that really gives you an overview of how Pat Lencioni got from The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which is the New York Times best-selling book that I'm sure many of you have read, to the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. And what you're going to see in this model, I think, is very helpful as a framework, but it begins with the team talking. And you'll see it's called My Dysfunctional Team. And I love the little thought bubbles. So without further ado, I'll show you this. And what I'd like you to do as you're watching it is think about, from your best and worst experiences, how would you see this playing out in your current experience and your past experience, okay? So here is the model.
This is my team, my dysfunctional team. It may look pretty normal on the surface, but underneath, there are 5 things going on that need serious attention. Let's take a look. She can't ask for help. He doesn't want to risk starting an argument. He's only pretending that he's on board. That's me. I don't think it's my job to make sure he does his job. And he only cares about his own goals. So that's my team. Maybe your team has its own challenges. In his New York Times best-selling book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Patrick Lencioni identifies 5 core dysfunctions that most teams face. The first dysfunction is an absence of trust among team members. This stems from their unwillingness to be vulnerable within the group. Vulnerability is about being able to say and genuinely mean things like, I screwed up, I need help, and I'm sorry. Team members who are not genuinely open with one another about their mistakes and weaknesses make it impossible to build a foundation for trust. This failure to build trust is damaging because it sets the tone for the second dysfunction, fear of conflict. Teams that lack trust are incapable of engaging in unfiltered and passionate debate of ideas. Instead, they resort to veiled discussions and guarded comments. A lack of healthy conflict ensures the third dysfunction, lack of commitment. Without airing their opinions in passionate and open debate, team members rarely, if ever, buy in and commit to decisions, though they may feign agreement during meetings. Teams that fail to get this commitment develop the fourth dysfunction, avoidance of accountability. Without committing to a clear plan of action, even the most focused and driven people often hesitate to call their peers on actions and behaviors that seem counterproductive to the good of the team. And this leads to the fifth dysfunction, inattention to results. Inattention to results occurs when team members put their individual needs, such as ego, career development, or recognition, above the collective goals of the team. Another way to understand this model is to take the opposite approach, a positive one, and imagine how members of truly cohesive teams behave. First, they trust each other. They engage in productive conflict around ideas. They commit to decisions and plans of action. They hold one another accountable for delivering against those plans. And they focus on the achievement of collective results. And that's it. These are the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. Each one is a deliberate choice made by the team. They do require discipline and persistence, but the payoff can be big. And there's a nice bonus. Not only will the group be stronger and more productive, but high-functioning teams are a lot more fun to work on.
It is true, isn't it? I heard somebody say, this is true. Yes, and it's interesting because I worked for Equifax in the late 80s, early 90s, and I worked for different areas of the company for different managers, and I had a completely different experience, right? You would think I worked for a completely different company. So that's the power of really understanding this. So again, the 5 dysfunctions you are familiar with and have probably experienced, but the flip side then, of course, is the foundation of trust, and really looking at then productive conflict, making sure that we're getting issues out on the table. And he talks about ideological conflict, really engaging in ideas, because if you don't do that, you don't really get buy-in, right? You get compliance, you get people going through the motions, but secretly waiting for that plan to fail because I thought it was a stupid idea anyway, right? You see that happen sometimes. And then, you know, they can really commit to decisions because there is clarity around what is it that you're supposed to achieve as a team, and you get people all aligned and across departments aligned if you do this well. And then again, the key is holding one another accountable, not just the boss. And we've seen some of that. Some of you I've had some opportunities to work with over the years, and we've seen where sometimes that doesn't happen and how you can work through it. And of course, ultimately, the focus is to achieve whatever the result is. So I should say that this ideally works with an intact team that really is interdependent and has some result that they're trying to achieve, because as you all know, many times in organizations there are quote-unquote teams that really are work groups that don't necessarily really have a common goal. And so this is not for that, basically, okay? So I'm gonna ask you to do a little exercise with me, and I am going to give you a prize, okay? This is where I'll draw later, but this is where you'll actually have to earn your prize, okay? So while developing this process, Wiley asked over 4,000 people what their experience with the 5 behaviors has been. So in a moment, I'm going to put some questions up, and I'm going to ask you to, you can just jot it down on a piece of scrap paper or something. What percentage of the group out of 100% do you think said yes to the question, okay? And so how it's going to work is if you guessed 84 and the right answer was 80, then you write down 4. You can write down the difference. If you guessed 76 and the answer was 80, you're going to write down 4. Very good. Okay, math test early in the morning, right? So no negative numbers, nothing like that, okay? But just the difference. And then you're going to add the total. There are 5 questions. And then whoever gets the lowest score is going to win something, all right? All right, here are the questions. So first question, I always wanted to say survey says, so I'll say survey says, like Richard Dawson. When coworkers admit their mistakes, would people be more effective? Or when coworkers admit their mistakes, does it make you trust them more? Okay, so how much, what percentage do you think said yes to that question? That's question number 1. Okay, let's see the new generation, somebody's putting it in their phone. I'm just talking about putting it, there you go. Oh, even all of us, all right, I love it. So do you think your workplace would be more effective if people were more frank in stating their opinions? Of course, how you're frank makes a difference, but assuming you do it well, What percentage do you think said yes? Okay. Question number 3. Do you sometimes feel that team projects suffer because people aren't committed enough? So what percentage said yes? Okay. Question number 4 is, would your work be more effective if people were better at holding one another accountable? And the last question is, in your work experience, have you seen projects suffer because people put their own needs ahead of the team's needs? Never happens. Okay? So everyone have the difference and add your totals. If we have a tie, we'll figure out another plan, but okay. So how many had?
Well, we don't have to do that.
Oh, I haven't given you the answers yet. Yeah, that would make a difference. That would make a difference. Thank you, David. Obviously, my coffee hasn't kicked in yet this morning. So you can't read my mind like the amazing Kreskin. So the answer to question number 1 was 84% about trust. The question about conflict was 71%. The question about commitment was 86%. About accountability, 89%. And last but not least, about results, 87%. Okay, now you can figure out your scores, right?
I'm at 42.
42, okay. So how many had between 40 and 50? Raise your hand. Okay. All right, how many had from 30 to 40? Okay. All right, how many had from 20 to 30? All right, and we're narrowing the field. Less, how about from 10 to 20? All right. And anybody less than 10? No? All right, you are the winner. Woohoo! Ashley, so I'm going to give you this cool pen, and it has a real neat thing for your iPad, etc. on it. Okay, so give her a round of applause. So what was the difference you had?
18.
18. All right, pretty good. I love it. Okay, great. All right, so just to reiterate again, really the key is trust, and trust is the foundation for everything. And if you don't have trust, you don't have anything else. And in this whole process, Lencioni makes the distinction about vulnerability-based trust. So the point there is, a lot of times I can trust somebody. Let's say, David and I have worked together for years. I know what he's going to do because, I kind of understand his personality. And there's a certain level of trust there, right? But that's what's known as predictive trust. But what I really want to have is more vulnerability-based trust, where I really feel confident that if he feels that if he's in over his head, he's going to tell me. Or if he needs something from me, he's going to share that with me. Or if I'm doing something that really isn't working for the team or for the group or whatever, he's going to also share that feedback with me. And so it's really that kind of foundation where we're authentic, we're open and honest. And some of you might be familiar with Brené Brown's work. Has anyone seen Brené Brown? Some nodding. Okay. So if you're not familiar with her, she's written a lot of books and gave a wonderful TED Talk on the power of vulnerability and so forth in the workplace. And she's a professor at the University of Houston, I believe. But I think it struck such a chord because we know that in many companies there is sort of this fake niceness, right? and even at Aetna, I can say this because they talk about it, they talk about Aetna nice because people are very genuine and caring, but sometimes that means that they don't give one another the feedback that they really need to be giving, okay? So that's really important. And it's not just, again, touchy-feely stuff. It's really important to understand that this has a financial impact. So I want to talk about the high cost of trust now. Cornell University actually has a big hotel and hospitality college, so I believe that's why it took place here. But they did some research to explore the link between trust and profit, okay? So they surveyed 6,500 employees at 76 Holiday Inns in the US and Canada, and they were asking them about trust and management. They were asking them about customer service and commitment. And the questions roughly were, do you believe your manager is going to do what they say they're going to do? like to Russ's point, do they walk the talk? You know, do they live their values? That kind of thing. And the other questions had to do with, do you feel proud to work for this hotel? And do you think that your team members would go the extra mile? So those were some of the questions. And so it was a 5-point scale. And what they found was a 1/8 of an increase in the trust level, a 2.5% increase translated into a profit increase per year per hotel of, what would you guess? I will give you the right answer. 1.5 million per hotel?
Oh, no. 10%.
Okay. Yeah, I would have maybe guessed, you know, $50,000, $100,000, something like that. But it's actually $250,000 per hotel, which is really amazing. Just an 1/8 of an increase, right? How much trust makes a difference. So why do you think that is? Just throw out some answers. Why would trust benefit you? Why would it result in a higher profit?
You want to do your best.
You want to do your best. Okay, what else?
I can ask for help.
I can ask for help. I don't have to be perfect all the time.
Try new things.
Try new things. You're more innovative, you're more creative, all of those things, right? What else?
When the employees are happy, that goes on to their loyal customers.
Exactly. Yes, you know the difference. When you walk into a hotel and they're not getting along and they're fighting, you can just feel it, right? They're snarky at the front desk, they're snarky in the restaurant, etc. Yeah, and so the question to you is, do you think this is limited to the hotel industry? You know, it probably applies in all industries, right? In the people business, we know that, but not everybody sees that sometimes. So it's really important to really understand how powerful that is. So really, you know, what if we could measure this? What if we really could see if people trust one another, if they're engaging in healthy conflict, if they are committing to decisions, not just, you know, nodding their head like that one guy, I really am not bought in, but I'm just gonna, you know, under the radar nod, you know, I love the little thought bubbles. Hold each other accountable and really, you know, focus on achieving some collective results, because we know what those results are. So that's what this process is. So for those of you who are familiar with DISC, how many are familiar with DISC? A lot. Okay, excellent. So basically, Wiley was the publisher of the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and many of Patrick's other books. He's written a number. Death by Meeting is another great one. If you haven't read, you just need to read that one. But Wiley bought Inkscape Publishing, which was the original DISC. And so since 2012, they've been trying to figure out a way to collaborate. And the power of bringing DISC into this is really very important, because now you can understand each team member's behavior, right? And rather than judge their behavior, you start to see, oh, I see, you're acting that way because that's just the way you see the world and what motivates you and how you work, versus you're just trying to make my life difficult, aren't you? Feels that way sometimes, right? But that's not the case. So if you're familiar with DISC, just at a high level, and I'll say a little bit more about it later, and you'll see it in the report as I start to walk through it, is, you know, different people have different priorities based on your primary style. So if somebody really is focused on collaboration and that's one of their priorities, they often will seek harmony. Or likewise, if they're really valuing relationships, they really want acceptance. And if they are more focused on results, they seek action, you know, your high Ds many times. And then someone who seeks the facts often has a priority on accuracy and might be a high C, etc. Okay, so I'll say more about that for those of you who aren't familiar. Just trust me on the coding for the moment. But really important to understand this, because then you can get into valuing differences more, okay? So there's some key assumptions that I want to just start out with, and that is basically that building trust is the foundation, and I've said that a number of times, but it's so critical. And also, understanding team members' DISC styles can help with trust, because one of the things that I've learned over the years, I've had the good fortune of having a wonderful mentor who worked with John Geyer at the very beginning of the development of the original DISC. And I also have a coach in Australia that I've been working with who has a lot of assessments around trust that are really very powerful. That different DISC styles have different priorities. For example, a high D really likes straightforwardness, right? And so for those of you who aren't familiar, high D stands for dominance. And basically these are your action-oriented, results-oriented, driven people, get it done yesterday. You know, you can tell folks like that, hey, this is how it is, and they're not offended. But if you tell a high I like me, my feelings might be a little hurt. Influence is what the high I stands for, and that's very much your classic people person, often a coach or somebody who really likes to connect and to network, and often very friendly and more people-oriented. I'm not doing justice to it, there's much more I could say, but they value openness. And I know for myself, if someone's not open with me, even though I know this, I sort of don't trust them, right? It's interesting. And a high S, they're much more around acceptance. So if they're judged, if they feel judged in any way, they feel very put off. And it's quite interesting that the dynamics between the diagonals, because a high D just wants straightforwardness, whereas somebody with a high S might be more diplomatic and not be so straightforward, and the high D will write them off right away. So a lot of times when I'm doing executive coaching and I'm working with a high S or a high C individual, and I have somebody at Walmart that I'm working with right now around this, he gets written off because he doesn't sometimes just state what he feels right away. He has to think about it. So we're working on, you know, how can you meet them halfway and vice versa. So it's fascinating. And then the high C really wants to know that you're going to be reliable, that it's going to be done on time, etc. Right? So it's fascinating. And if you understand that, then you see that it's a lot more layered and rich, and you can really understand how to work with people in a different way. Okay? So the outcomes of this process are that, you know, really you establish this strong basis for commitment, and you really get people pulling together. And at the end of the process, they create a contract for how they're going to move forward. There's an action plan at each stage of the process so that they really know, what do we specifically need to work on, okay? So how it works is there's one assessment, and it's an individual report that everyone takes, and then there's a team report that's generated, and the process walks the team through how are you doing on each of these elements, and more importantly, what can you do about it? And it's very much around a dialogue. They agree what they need to do differently, and then there's some skills-based trainings in the whole process too. Because again, I'll say it again, you know, when people are really open and honest and transparent with one another, and they trust one another, then magic can happen. You can really get things done. But the converse is, you know, miserable, and we've all been there. And so really the other piece that I think is critical to understand about interpersonal differences is that by nature of being a human being, we're sort of judging machines. You know, we just judge people. We don't realize it perhaps, but we make assessments, you know, in a nanosecond, and we all have the tendency to think that we're right. And well, we are in our own mind, right, in our own perspective, but really we want to get to where we're understanding other people, but not just from the framework of, you know, I understand where he's coming from, but why is he doing that? And really start to move up to respecting that and to valuing that and really appreciating that, and also really harnessing the power of that. And I know in my life, because I am a high I secondary D, I don't always look for the details or the process or the procedures and so forth. In fact, I really don't like them very much. But I've learned that, you know, sometimes they're really very powerful, really important. We were talking about investments on the elevator coming up, Tom and I was thinking, boy, I wish I had had some high C people helping me analyze my commercial real estate when I bought it years ago, right? I might not have made that mistake. I'm looking at the commercial real estate people over here. But at any rate, you know, there's value in the diversity, obviously, okay? So I want to walk you through the report. I've put around the room some samples of that you can share with one another. And again, I have your cards if you'd like me to send you information after the fact. I'm more than happy to do that. But the profile basically gives you a color-coded score of how your team is doing. So the red is sort of the danger zone, the yellow is the middle, and green is is good. However, I have seen teams with a lot of green who still have opportunity for growth and improvement, right? And sometimes, rarely, they have been hesitant to really fill it out with candor, and so there's really a little bit more underneath the surface. But this profile really gets to what's really going on. So it's not to beat people up or make them feel badly, but just you can't get to where you want to go if you don't know where you are, right? I mean, that's just a simple principle that we all know is true. So you see how the team scores on each of these 5 behaviors, and then it breaks it down into more granularity. So there are 4 questions for each of the 5 behaviors, and you see how they average for specific behaviors. So the questions around trust are very powerful. Do people acknowledge weaknesses to one another? I don't know about you, but I worked on a lot of teams where there was a fair amount of, what should we say, positioning or, posturing perhaps, where people weren't really being clear about when they needed help, to your point. Or people didn't apologize to one another. People weren't really open with how they felt about things. So it gets at that and what to do about it, okay? So, you really get a lot more clarity into how the team sees itself and what exactly they see as the issue. And it's very enlightening many times. You as the team leader, if you're the team leader, might have a completely different perspective. So it's great to get this more or less objective data back, right? And then everyone can talk about it. And as sometimes we say, the elephant in the room now is visible, right? We're talking about the elephant rather than just hiding that big old animal, that beast, right? Okay, so moving on then, at each stage of the model, you get into the DISC behaviors. So each individual gets information about how they influence the team, what they're doing that's helping trust or conflict or commitment or accountability or results, and what they're doing that might be less than effective behavior, which is really, really critical. And then they talk about it, right? So I'll show you some more specific examples in just a moment. But you also get the overall DISC map. And for those of you who aren't familiar with DISC, there's more information on page 10 about, at a high level, what motivates each particular style and what their fears are and how they would be more effective. And of course, there's a lot more to DISC than you just get in here, but you get an overview of the process. There's a video and there's some tools after the fact that people will really understand how their particular style is influencing the team dynamics, okay? So you get to see that and the distribution. And by the way, this is the Decision Tech team. If you remember the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, the book was based on a team in Silicon Valley called Decision Tech. And so that's what this is based on, okay? And then there are culture questions too to ask, okay, what could the team do to really improve these behaviors, okay, which is really, really powerful. So in this case, it's hard to see up here, but this team said the #1 problem that they had that's interfering with trust was people were gossiping. That never happens, right? Never happens on a team. So they agreed, all right, we should stop doing this. And then the questions are personalized and dynamic to that team's responses, and start to have the dialogue then about, okay, what can we do differently to make sure this isn't happening on our team? That make sense? Okay, great. So again, here's the more granular details. I mentioned gossiping. There were some other things too, admitting mistakes, letting go of grudges, etc. Okay, and when we get into conflict, we'll see the different healthy and unhealthy conflict behaviors that people engage in. But basically, if you don't have trust, then you don't have that healthy, productive conflict. Why? Why would you say?
Trust is the foundation of it.
Very good. And why? What is it about a lack of trust that would have you not speak up?
You don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want to put yourself out there.
Yeah, because what could happen?
Well,
ostracized, judged, fired. Yeah, yeah. Who said that, Russ? Yes. We used to call those career limiting moves, right? Yeah. And I remember in my younger years, particularly at UPS, I was in trouble all the time because I would speak up. And you know, I in all fairness, am more artful at it now than I perhaps was back then. But you know, there are certain environments that are not conducive to that kind of conversation, and it's such a shame. And in today's environment, we can't afford not to have these kinds of conversations. So we're going to do another little exercise, okay? And there's no right answer now, so I won't mess that up again. But at any rate, what I have seen, and you've seen too, is that different people, based on their disc styles, but also based on their upbringing and their values and their beliefs and all sorts of issues, their culture, have different levels of tolerance for different kinds of conflict behaviors, right? So here they are, and I'm going to ask you just to turn to the partner that you were working with before, the little small group, and I'm going to actually put it up on the PowerPoint like this. So I'd like you to talk through how you personally respond to these different types of conflict behaviors. Do you see them as, you know, perfectly acceptable, no problem? Do you think, yeah, they're tolerable, or are they unacceptable, flat out unacceptable? Because you know you'll go to some companies and team members are, you know, pounding on the table and swearing and yelling and that kind of I've worked with some high-tech firms and some construction firms like that, but you better not be doing that at IBM or Coca-Cola, right, in Atlanta or wherever. So just what I'd like you to do is talk about that for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to ask you just not necessarily how you feel about things, but what was your experience of chatting through the differences, and how alike were you, how different were you, what insights did you have about talking through that? Okay, so give you a couple of minutes. So in the program we do a lot around ground rules and establishing what really works and what makes sense for us as a team, which is important. But I love this next piece, and this is a conflict team map that is just the best. I think it is really a brilliant way to think about this, depending on your disc style. And again, it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but it's certainly something that's pretty accurate. There's a tendency to have more comfort and a higher, perhaps not even necessarily skill level, but I would say comfort with certain kinds of healthy behavior in conflict, but also certain kinds of unhealthy behavior in conflict. So as I mentioned, I told on myself, I'm this high I here with a secondary D. So 9 times out of 10, I will address issues, you know, head on. I will speak up, I will express myself, and hopefully I will do it in a healthy way, in a constructive manner. I've learned past 20 plus years what not to do. But again, sometimes if it's unhealthy, it can be gossiping or saying something that you would regret, right? On the other end of the spectrum, telling you Jimmy a little bit, I think she said she's an SC over here, is that okay? So down here, an SC is often very calm, you know, a nice calming influence, a good listener, so her team member's nodding, yes, she is. But do you just love conflict when somebody's not so much? Right, so there's a tendency to retreat, and sometimes a little bit more passive aggressive behaviors on that end of the spectrum. So this is a really great way to understand why people are behaving the way that they are, okay? So, you know, again, the point of this is when people engage in healthy conflict, then they're much more likely to commit to decisions. And there's a great quote, people who weigh in are more likely to buy in. And I love that because that's critical to understand. It's not about consensus. I don't necessarily have to 100% agree. I don't necessarily have to get everyone to think the same way. But as long as everyone feels like they've been heard, that they have really taken into account everyone's opinion as a group, as a team, then they're much more likely to commit to decisions. The challenge is most of the time people haven't really expressed what they feel, and therefore they haven't really bought in. But they'll, you know, feign agreement. They'll say that they are bought in, but they're not really, okay? So I'm gonna go through these. Yes, ma'am. No, please ask.
I have an observation that leads to a question.
Okay, great.
It's a little model that I'm working on in my head, and it basically divides people into 2 There are people, when you meet them, you have their trust 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people, when you meet them, you start at 0 and you earn their trust.
Yes.
So the question then is twofold, like to what extent does the model address that? Because if I'm thinking you have 100% trust
Mm-hmm.
and you're losing it, but I'm not communicating that to you.
Yes.
And you think you're at 0, I don't know when I'm gaining trust.
Yes.
And the converse is true. I don't know when I'm losing or when I'm gaining.
Yes.
So to what extent does the model address that? Because you're going to lose and gain trust at any point in time.
Yes, very, very great question. Thank you for that. So I'll answer it in several different ways. The beauty of this is you're measuring where people are starting, and then later you do a progress report, and then you can measure at the end. So you see how the needle is moving in each of the areas, which is really powerful. But because you're integrating DISC into each piece of the puzzle, or the pyramid, if you will, you are talking about that openly. You know, what is important to you for me to earn your trust, to gain your trust, and to keep your trust? And so you're having that dialogue on an ongoing basis.
Is there a loop around how do I regain trust if I lose it?
Yes. And that really happens more at this stage, at the commitment stage, you know, and oftentimes what I'll spend time doing is spending a lot of time on the trust and conflict piece. And you really need to do that first, and then you can come to the commitment later. But many times people want to get through that messy conflict, you know, the old Tuckman model, the norming, storming. We don't want that storming. And so you don't really get to the commitment level and don't really have the buy-in. But at each stage of the process, you're sort of looping back to trust. So if I didn't answer your question, see me offline and I'll get you a lot more detail about that, okay? Yeah, good. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you that each of the different stages of the model have the same process. There are DISC questions, there are where does the team see it question, there are culture questions, and what to do about it. But what I love is the accountability piece. And again, that's where teams have the biggest problem, holding peer-to-peer accountability, holding one another accountable. And this next slide, I think, says it all, right? So see if you can relate to that. Sure glad the hole isn't at our end. Yeah. So, you know, there's no such thing as a hole in the other person's side of the boat. I'm sorry, we're all going down. This is the challenge today, is we're so interdependent. Goldman Sachs, what else? All of them, AIG, Enron, Enron was more pervasive, but Arthur Andersen, a small team doing the wrong thing, took a whole big company down, which, you know, there you go. So I'll fast forward to the end because I want to just show you the fact that you get overview of the team's greatest strengths and the team's greatest challenges. Okay, so there are 3 greatest strengths, 3 greatest challenges that the team is presented with, and then you talk through, okay, how are you going to deal with that? What action steps do you need to take to make sure that that is dealt with, addressed, and throughout the whole process there are skills, activities, and so forth too. Okay, so I think that's really critical because then you really see, okay, we have some strengths to build on, but we also have some challenges that we can address, and basically what's happening is you're creating an action plan around which they do that, okay? So, you know, just ask you to think about how would that change your work experience and the teams that you support if people really were working together, rowing the same boat, right? So at a high level, just to tell you a little bit about how it works, there are, I would say, you know, 21 and a half hours to the whole program. You can do it in lots of different ways, and you know, essentially the trust and conflict and the intro are 1 day, and the rest can be done 2 days, 3 days. I like to do DISC first, a half day of DISC at a deep dive level, and then do the program. But what I love about it is you get individual results, you get team results, you get the culture results, and then you really get the team as well as this whole methodology to give you specific action steps. what do I do about this, right? Which is really the power of the whole process, okay? And there is an annotated team report for the facilitator. I almost always recommend an outside facilitator, but again, if you're a training person or an HR person or a partner, you can often help your teams as long as you're not on them, right? And this really gives you tips for how to interpret the score. It also gives you normative data. Over 7,000 people have gone through the program at this point, so there's a lot of benchmarking that you can use or not, depending on how well the team is doing, whether it would discourage them or encourage them, basically. But a lot of additional information. They do a great job. There's podcasts and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's really about results and rowing together. Has anyone read the book, The Boys in the Boat? Oh, wonderful book. I have it on Audible, so I am into crew now just because it's about the crew team in the 1936 Olympics, basically. But I just want you to close by, before I open it up for questions and I'm aware of the time, just turn to your partner and talk about or tell your partner one team that you think might benefit from this process. And then if you would like to have me contact you, let me know that. I've already got your business cards, so it doesn't make sense to write 5 behaviors, but you have my card and you can reach out to me, and I'll also send everyone here sample reports if you're interested in that.